This lecture marks the beginning of my series on the principles of microeconomics. I will be introducing the concept of microeconomics and economics in general in order to give you a better idea of what exactly it is that we're trying to do when we analyze graphs, make predictions, etc. The syllabus for this lecture includes defining what exactly economics is, asking the basic economic questions, defining a new way of thinking, and taking a look at economics as a social science and a policy tool. Once you complete this lecture, I hope that you understand what economics is and why it is essential that everyone gain a basic understanding of how the economy works. Let's start off by defining what exactly economics is. Before doing that, I want to introduce two concepts, the first of which is scarcity. Scarcity is a very real problem that we as humans face. We can't have everything. We can't satisfy our unlimited wants because we only have a limited amount of resources. An incentive is a reward that encourages an action or a penalty that discourages another action. In economics, the most common incentive we see is price. Prices act as incentives for people to buy and for suppliers to sell. Now that we know what scarcity and incentives are, let's formally define economics. Economics is the social science that studies how society allocates scarce resources to satisfy unlimited wants. We look at the choices of individuals, governments, and entire societies as they choose what to do with their limited time, money, human capital, natural resources, etc. Economics is divided into two major categories, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics is concerned with the study of choices that individuals and businesses make, while macroeconomics is concerned with the study of performance of the national and global economy. I like to use the analogy of a tree and a forest. A tree is an individual entity. If we study this tree, we are looking at a very small part of an entire forest. When we look at the entire forest, we take into account all the trees in the forest. We look at things in aggregates. The single tree is analogous to microeconomics, and the forest is analogous to macroeconomics.
I have a question for you. If economics is simply an issue of examining how people choose to use this many resources to satisfy this many wants, why do we have both macroeconomics and microeconomics? Really, it's simply a question of scope. Microeconomics deals with choices of a single entity, one product, one price, one consumer, one household, one business, or even one industry. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, deals with the actions of the economy as a whole, the country's income, which we'll call GDP, all prices, or inflation, the business sector, which is all businesses, or unemployment across the entire economy. Next time, positive and normative analysis.
Let's talk about the basic foundation of economics. What economics is, what's involved with it, and what the basic economic problem is. The word economy comes from two Greek words, one meaning house and the other meaning distribute. It was first used to describe the management of a household, but by the mid-1700s, it came to describe the management of the resources of a country. Now, the basic economic problem that we're concerned about is this. Needs and wants are unlimited, but resources are scarce. What are resources? Resources are otherwise known as the factors of production, and they include land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Everything it takes to produce the stuff that you and I buy on a regular basis in our economy. So let's get back to this word scarcity. What does it really mean when a resource is scarce? Scarcity in general terms means that the demand for something is much greater than the supply, or there is not enough money to buy it. The exact definition in economics is that there are insufficient resources to satisfy everyone's needs and wants. And whether you're talking about oil, from which we get the gasoline that powers most of our cars, or corn, even seats in a movie theater, there isn't enough for everyone to get what they want at a zero price. You know something is scarce if you try to offer it for free and you don't have enough of it for everyone who stands in line to get it. So how does a society decide who gets what? Well, producers charge a price for it. That way, whoever values it the most will pay the most for it. This is how scarce resources are allocated, or divided up and distributed efficiently in our economy. When you go to the store, you can't buy everything you want, so you must make choices to buy one thing instead of another. If you walk into the store with $50 and the store offers you 500 different items, you're only going to walk out of that store with a cart full of stuff that totals $50. Scarcity always leads to choice, and people can actually make better decisions because they have a better understanding of how much each choice costs. So now that we understand what scarcity is all about, let's talk about what economics is. Economics is the social science that studies how people use scarce resources to satisfy unlimited needs and wants. Greek words, one meaning house and the other meaning distribute. It was first used to describe the management of a household, but by the mid-1700s, it came to describe the management of the resources of a country. Now, the basic economic problem that we're concerned about is this. Needs and wants are unlimited, but resources are scarce. What are resources? Resources are otherwise known as the factors of production, and they include land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Everything it takes to produce the stuff that you and I buy on a regular basis in our economy. So let's get back to this word scarcity. What does it really mean when a resource is scarce? Scarcity in general terms means that the demand for something is much greater than the supply, or there is not enough money to buy it. The exact definition in economics is that there are insufficient resources to satisfy everyone's needs and wants. And whether you're talking about oil, from which we get the gasoline that powers most of our cars, or corn, even seats in a movie theater, there isn't enough for everyone to get what they want at a zero price. You know something is scarce if you try to offer it for free and you don't have enough of it for everyone who stands in line to get it. So how does a society decide who gets what? Well, producers charge a price for it. That way, whoever values it the most will pay the most for it. This is how scarce resources are allocated, or divided up and distributed efficiently in our economy. When you go to the store, you can't buy everything you want, so you must make choices to buy one thing instead of another. If you walk into the store with $50 and the store offers you 500 different items, you're only going to walk out of that store with a cart full of stuff that totals $50. Scarcity always leads to choice, and people can actually make better decisions because they have a better understanding of how much each choice costs. So now that we understand what scarcity is all about, let's talk about what economics is. Economics is the social science that studies how people use scarce resources to satisfy unlimited needs and wants.
It's crucial as an economist, or any analyst for that matter, that you can distinguish between positive analysis and normative analysis. Positive analysis is factual analysis, the analysis of what is. You can recognize a positive statement because it can be tested, it can be proven or disproven. There are no personal judgments involved. For example, I could tell you that it's 72 degrees outside today, and you could verify that my statement is true or untrue. Normative analysis, on the other hand, is opinion-based analysis, the analysis of what should be or ought to be. You can recognize a normative statement because it involves personal judgment and ideals. It cannot be proven or disproven. What if I tell you that orange is better than red? Can you verify this? Can you test it? Can you prove it or disprove it? In the end, we need both types to make policy. The think tank groups engage in positive analysis, then turn their findings over to the policymakers who use this information along with their own judgment to create policies that they feel are best for society. If you happen to disagree with their policies, then you can vote for someone else. Take a look at a headline from today's news. Can you distinguish the positive statements from the normative statements? Next time, graphs.
Let's move on and talk about the three basic questions that economics tries to answer. Goods and services are objects that people value and produce to satisfy wants. What is produced varies across countries and changes over time. It really depends on what people want or need. How to produce is determined by the technologies and resources available. The basic resources, or factors of production as we will now refer to them as, are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Land refers to all natural resources. Labor entails the work, time, and effort that people devote to producing goods and services. The quality of this labor depends on human capital, the knowledge and skills people obtain from education, training, and experience. Capital includes the tools, machines, and buildings that are used to produce goods. Entrepreneurship is the human resource that organizes the previous three resources in a manner that produces goods and services. The last question that we need to answer is that of who to produce for. Who can consume goods is, in most societies, determined by their income. People earn their incomes by selling the services of the factors of production that they own. Land earns rent, labor earns wages, capital earns interest, and entrepreneurship earns profits. Choices made in self-interest of a person thinks that the particular choice is the best one available to them. Choices made in the social interest result from an outcome that is best for society as a whole. Resource use is considered efficient if it is not possible to make someone better off without making someone else worse off. We keep changing the way we use our resources until we reach this point of efficiency. A lot of times people use the word fairness when talking about the social interest. It is a little difficult to define this though. For example, most people say that too much inequality is unfair. But how much is unfair? Where do you draw the line and say that inequality below this point is fair, but above this point isn't? Globalization is defined as the expansion of international trade, borrowing and lending, and investment. It is, on the whole, regarded as a good thing, but still has some negative side effects too. Globalization is in the self-interest of consumers who want low-cost goods produced in their countries and of multinational corporations who produce in low-cost countries and sell goods elsewhere. Conversely, globalization isn't necessarily in the interest of low-wage workers in developing countries who produce these goods. Another downside, one which is becoming less prominent nowadays, is the existence of information age monopolies. Microsoft is a great example. Microsoft was able to sell computers at a much higher than market value at some point because it was the only producer. Microsoft's profits increased, but many people weren't able to buy a computer as a result. Climate change is also a result of people making decisions based on self-interest. More often than not, the environment is harmed when decisions are made in the pursuit of self-interest. Economic instability can also result from banks who lend too much internationally in the pursuit of self-interest. Lending more allows banks to earn more interest, but when banks extend loans to high-risk borrowers, they increase the rate to compensate for potential defaults. The only problem is that the probability of a default is now much greater, increasing the chances that the borrower will not pay their loan. This could result in economic instability.
By definition, an economic model or theory is a simplified version of reality that allows us to observe, understand, and make predictions about economic behavior. Well, what does this mean? How does it apply to us, and why do we need to simplify reality? When I ask the question, how much realism do we want in a model, most students will respond as much as possible, or 100%. But is this true? Is more realism always preferred? Let me give you an example. Suppose that it's the end of the semester, and to celebrate, I'll be having a big party at my house. You're invited, but how will you get there? You need some kind of directions, probably a map, right? Well, how much realism do you want your map to have? 100%? Stop for a moment and think what 100% realism would mean. In your map, 1 mile would equal 1 mile. Where would you possibly put it? Okay, so maybe not full scale, but surely we want as much realism as possible, right? Again, think about what this means. Your map would show every rock, every pothole, every blade of grass. Well, okay, we probably don't need or want 100% realism. Not only is it cumbersome, but the minor details tend to get in the way, distracting us from our end goal. Was that the 17th cow or the 19th cow? So, if you want to focus on the end goal, getting to the party, what level of detail do you really need? If you're like me, you're probably interested in the major cross streets closest to your destination and perhaps some general directions and major landmarks along the way. Perhaps as you near your destination or end goal, you'd want a bit more detail. It's the third cross street, fourth house on the right, that kind of thing. But again, 100% detail or realism is neither necessary nor desired. So back to the question. How much realism do you want in your model? The answer to this question is rather nonspecific. Enough. We want enough realism to allow us to achieve our end goal, to reach our destination. How do I know if there's enough? How do I determine if my model is good? Well, if my model, my simplified version of reality, is a good one, then it helps me to observe, understand, and make predictions about my topic. In the case of the map was good, that is, I have sufficient detail if I successfully achieve my end goal, if I reach the party. At various points this semester you may ask me, but in the real world, isn't it the case that, fill in the blank? Often my response to you will be to bear in mind that we are dealing with a model, a simplified version of reality. Is it perfectly realistic? No. Does it allow us to observe, understand, and make predictions about economic behavior? You bet. The models we'll use this semester may be in the form of verbal statements or tables of data or graphs or mathematical equations. In episode number 6, I'll give a brief review of graphs before we move on to setting up a model that will help us look at
The next thing I want to touch on is the economic way of thinking. I want to lay out a few assumptions that we make in introductory economics. These assumptions apply to all the models that we will see in the rest of this course. For every choice that we make, we face a trade-off. Scarcity is the reason that we have to make choices in the first place. If scarcity was not an issue, we would be able to do everything that we wanted. In economics, we assume that people make rational choices. This means that before making any decision, a person will compare the costs and the benefits associated and pick the option that brings the greatest net benefit to them. I know in the real world that is not always the case, but for simplicity's sake, we will assume that it is. I talked about comparing costs and benefits, but it's very important to understand exactly what costs and benefits are. Costs are quite intuitive. They signify something that we need to give up in order to get something. Benefits, on the other hand, represent the gain or the pleasure that something brings from consuming it. The benefit derived from consuming a good varies from person to person. It depends on individual preferences. So the benefit attained by one individual from consuming a good could be different from another person. Economists measure benefit by the maximum value, whether it be in terms of monetary or other goods, that a person is willing to give up in order to gain something else. In the last slide, I mentioned this idea of every choice being a trade-off. I'll formally introduce the concept. This reality that all choices pose a trade-off is known as opportunity cost. By definition, the opportunity cost of consuming something is the highest valued alternative that must be foregone to attain it. Let's say that I have $10 and I can spend it on either food or a movie. If I go to see the movie, the opportunity cost is the food that I could have eaten. Opportunity cost arises because of the problem of scarcity. If scarcity weren't an issue, then neither the movie nor the food would have had an opportunity cost. Economists also assume that people choose at the margin. This means that people compare the benefit of consuming a little more of a good with the cost of consuming a little more of that good. The marginal benefit is known as the benefit derived from an increase in the consumption of one more unit of a good, and the marginal cost is known as the opportunity cost of consuming one additional unit of a good. Economists take human nature as given. We view people as acting in their own self-interest in order to gain the most benefit for themselves. As I mentioned before, how much benefit someone gains depends on their own preferences. But in general, people will try to maximize their benefit regardless of their preferences. The whole point of economics, or at least microeconomics, is to predict the self-interested choices that people make by looking at the incentives they face. We can do this because we assume that people undertake activities in which the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. This means that the additional benefit derived from consuming an additional unit of a good is more than the opportunity cost of consuming an additional unit of that same good.
Graphs, love them or hate them, they'll be an absolutely essential tool for analyzing economic behavior in this class. If you're already a graph meister, feel free to turn this video off right now. I just want to go through a very basic review. Okay, repeat after me. Graphs are easy. I can do this. All I need to do is count. No, really, what's a basic number line except a graph? Of course, we want to look at relationships between things, so we need to be able to count two things at the same time. I can do this by adding a second number line. The good news is, typically we won't even need all of this, since we very rarely deal with negative numbers. We can leave these areas out so that we have a more familiar looking set of lines, one horizontal and one vertical. These two lines, the axes, will allow us to measure what's happening between two variables. I'll call them something generic right now, like x and y. It's possible that x and y will exhibit what's known as a positive or direct relationship. If they do, then x and y will move together. That is, both of them increase or both of them decrease together. Let me give you an example. Instead of x, what if I have the number of A's that Dr. McGlasson gives this semester? Instead of y, I have the number of students who enroll for the class next semester. If I never give an A, people aren't going to be very anxious to sign up for my class, and I'm going to have very low enrollment. If I give lots of A's, however, the class gets to be very popular and lots of students enroll. So I see that there is a positive or direct relationship between the number of A's that are given and the number of students who enroll for the class in the future. Alternatively, x and y may exhibit a negative or indirect relationship. If they do, then x and y will move in opposite directions. That is, as one rises, the other falls. For example, how about instead of the number of A's on the horizontal axis, I put the number of F's given by Dr. McGlasson. And then on the vertical axis, I'm going to keep the number of students enrolling in the class. If I fail practically everyone in the class, why would anyone want to take my class in the future? I find that a large number of F's translates to a fairly low number of students enrolling. If I hardly ever fail anyone, lots of students are going to take my class. So a very small number of Fs translates to a fairly high level of enrollment. So I'm finding that there's a negative or inverse relationship between the number of Fs that I give in future enrollment in my class. This negative or inverse relationship exhibited between the two variables has a negative slope. There is one final possibility. X and Y could exhibit a constant or independent relationship. Let me give you an example where I have two completely unrelated variables that are going to illustrate this. What if, on the horizontal axis, I have the number of students enrolled in my class? On the vertical axis, the number of dogs in the McGlasson household. I happen to have 2. Now, whether I have no students, 50 students, 150 students, I'm going to have 2 dogs. So if no students enrolled, 2 dogs. 50 students enrolled, 2 dogs. 150 students enrolled, 2 dogs. I find with the constant or independent relationship, I have a straight horizontal line that's not showing either a positive or negative slope. It's got a slope of 0. The number of dogs is completely unchanging as the number of students changes. Over the course of the semester, I'll ask you whether you can identify a relationship as being a positive relationship or negative relationship. So you may want to see if you can think of some examples of each to give yourself some practice. Next time, how do you use graphs to illustrate scarcity and choice?
In the last section of the series on the economic problem, I wanted to briefly discuss the types of economies that exist and the ones that the rest of the series will be based on. Throughout history, 2 main types of economies have emerged as viable options for organizing a nation's resources. The first type of economy is one which is centrally planned. This means that an institution such as a government will answer the 3 basic economic questions we have seen in a previous video. What to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce is all decided by the government. Free markets are also known as decentralized markets. This means that no one person or institution runs the entire economy. Prices and quantities of all goods in the economy are determined by the market forces of supply and demand, which we will explore in the next series. Historical evidence suggests that central planning does not work very well in the long run because the central planners don't know people's production possibilities and their preferences. Thus, resources are misallocated and the economy ends up producing at a point inside the PPF. Additionally, centrally planned economies ignore the concept of incentives. Thus, any firm within the economy would not be functioning as efficiently as possible. There would be no incentive to become more efficient in producing a given good. Thus, old and outdated methods of production would continue to be used. This is only one example of the inefficiencies caused by a lack of incentives. For decentralized markets to work, we need 4 things to be in place. A firm is an economic unit that hires factors of production and organizes them to produce and sell goods and services. A market is some arrangement that allows buyers and sellers of goods to get information and to do business with each other. This doesn't have to be a physical place, just some arrangement. Amazon is an example of a marketplace that does not have a physical location. The website allows buyers and sellers from around the world to connect with each other. Markets, however, can only work when property rights exist. Property rights are the social arrangements that govern the ownership, use, and disposal of anything that people value. The term real property rights refers to rights of ownership to land, building, machinery. Financial property includes stocks, bonds, and money in the bank. Intellectual property refers to the intangible product of creative effort. This property includes music, books, inventions, etc. Property rights is an incentive to innovate. Financial gain is the reward for those who choose to innovate. If property rights didn't exist, and people could simply steal property, then financial resources would be diverted to protecting people's property rather than innovation. Money is a commodity or a token that is uniformly accepted as a method of payment. The circular flow model is a highly simplified model of the free market economy, but illustrates the basic idea of how the economy works. In this model, we are going to assume that there is no government and that there is no international trade either. The first main entity in our economy is households. This consists of the general population. The second main entity in our economy is firms. We also have goods markets. This is simply the marketplace where goods and services are traded between buyers and sellers. It is not an entity like a household or a firm. Factor markets are similar to the goods markets in that they allow buyers and sellers to trade, but in this case, we are not trading goods or services. We are trading the factors of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship on these markets. The circular flow works like this. Households spend money in the goods market. This money goes straight to firms, as firms are the sellers of these goods. Households, in return for their spent money, get some good or service. This good or service comes directly from the firm. The firm offers goods and the households buy the goods. In order to produce the goods, the firm needs to buy resources from the factor markets. It is households that provide the resources of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. The firm must buy these resources from the factor markets, so it spends its money over there. At the end of the day, households are selling the factors of production, so the money goes back to them. From the diagram, it is clear that money simply flows from households and firms through the goods and factor markets. Goods and services flow from the firm to the household through the goods market, and economic resources flow from households to firms in factor markets.
So as we know, economists are trying to answer questions. We're trying to answer very specific micro-level questions, and we're going to try to answer very large macro-style questions. So let's look at a couple of areas that we might try to weigh in on how to solve a problem or how to create a solution. One of those, suppose we look at traffic congestion. Everybody gets really uptight and very anxious when you're sitting in traffic. How might an economist look at trying to fix this problem of traffic congestion? First, we're going to be very straightforward in how we look at it. If we look at our car and how much space it takes up and decreases the distance between other vehicles on the highway. So we're going to be very objective and get a lot of information. What's the normal reaction to a shorter distance between moving cars is to slow down. Right? So if we add another car to traffic, we're going to slow everybody down. So when you enter the highway, everybody else has to slow down. One possible solution to this is to try to figure out how to get an individual driver to incorporate how much more time everybody else has to spend on the highway. One solution an economist might look at is to try to add a tax to driving on the road. If you add a tax to driving on a highway or driving on a road, then each individual driver has to try to look at their effect on other drivers. Now, the job for the economist is to figure out how much is the appropriate tax. And we're going to look at how an economist might answer that question very soon. A larger scale question or a more global question might be poverty and what policies might lower poverty and might increase standards of living around the world. This becomes very important when we look at poverty in Africa. We know that a lot of the countries in Africa have very low standards of living, at least compared to the more developed countries around the world. But Africa has the second largest continent, both in area and in population, and accounts for 12% of the world's human population. So if we can attack poverty and try to figure out how to reduce poverty around the world, we're going to have a huge impact on a very large portion of the human population. And then we might look at any given economy and try to explain how it is that an economy goes through a business cycle, or when we might enter into a recession, and then more proactively, how we might try to get out of a recession. So we can look back at the experience of the U.S. economy over the last several decades. Over the last several decades, policymakers seem to know how to restore growth and prosperity. But then we saw a financial crisis and a recession that began in 2007 that shook the confidence of people around the United States and around the world. And this financial crisis was so severe and the recession so deep that it made us question how we might react to those things as policymakers. So we're going to look back at what happened during that recession to try to get a better idea of how major countries in the world, how we might give more and better policies to counteract a severe recession. Now let's look at how economists think and what the economic way of thinking is and how we might attack answering the questions that are posed to economists. Well, economists in general use assumptions to simplify the world. We're going to build economic models that have supply and demand graphs that are going to interact with each other. We're going to have a demand and a supply. And then we're going to try to look at how the decisions of producers interact with decisions of consumers and how those interactions determine the quantity and the price of a good or a service. Now, when we build this model, which we're going to learn a lot about in this course, when we build this model, we have to make assumptions to simplify how the world works. Right? One of those assumptions is we're going to isolate the variables that we look at. Right? In this model, we're looking at a variable of price and quantity and how changes in the price might affect the quantity. We call this a ceteris paribus assumption, right? That any variable that affects the supply and demand of a good or a service is held constant. So we isolate two of the variables that we're looking at, assuming everything else is held fixed. Now, this is an oversimplification of how the world works, because in reality, all kinds of things happen at the same time. But it makes it very hard to answer questions if we're trying to look at how everything in the world changes all at the same time. So we're going to isolate the variables that we're interested in looking at, assuming that we're holding other variables constant. Now, that doesn't mean we don't think those other variables change, but we need to simplify the world so that we can make reasonable choices and decisions about how one variable affects another variable. In the end, we might add up changes of all the variables and try to figure out how multiple different changes affect one aspect of our economy. But we have to do that first by simplifying our assumption and getting down to just a ceteris paribus, or looking at two variables at one time. Economists also look at small changes in one variable and how that small change affects another variable. We call this a marginal change. In other words, a small or 1 unit change in a value. For example, how much more will you earn if you work for another hour? And that's a marginal change in your labor input, and we try to figure out how does that affect your income. By looking at small changes, we're able to refine our analysis and become much better at looking at how people make choices. Finally, we assume that rational people respond to incentives. And this is another way to think about economics. This is the study of how rational people respond to incentives. And we think it'd be foolish to think that rational people wouldn't respond to incentives. This is one of the key assumptions of most economic analysis, right? That people act in their own self-interest. Now let's look at how this economic way of thinking might answer that we would be posed. Again, let's look at the congestion problem. We're assuming, as an economist, how are we going to approach the problem of traffic congestion? Each driver slows down other drivers, but each driver ignores the costs that they're imposing on these other drivers. When I get on the freeway, I am slowing everybody else down. But I ignore how my entering the freeway slows everybody else down because it's not a cost that I have to incur. So the economic way of looking at it is to impose a congestion tax that gets me to not ignore these time costs. So the question we want to answer is, how high should the tax be? Well, first, we have to use assumptions to simplify. And if we looked at how every single car affected other people's travel time, and that was different for every car, that would be too complicated. So we're going to assume that every car has the same effect on travel time of other cars. And so this is an assumption we're making to simplify our analysis. Now, we're also going to isolate the variables we're looking at. We make the ceteris paribus assumption that everything else that affects travel behavior, which there are lots of things that are going to affect travel behavior, like the price of gasoline, bus fares, consumer income, all of these things are going to affect traffic congestion and travel behavior. But if I were to look at both the effect of one car entering the freeway and price of gasoline, bus fare, and consumer income, the analysis would get too cumbersome and too hard to tease out the effect of the one driver. So we're going to assume that all these things remain fixed. Right? So we make an assumption to simplify the world. One of those assumptions is that every car that enters the freeway affects other people's travel time the same. We also assume that other variables that affect travel behavior are held fixed. And then we're going to think at the margin. What's the effect of one car going on the highway? Okay, so if the marginal driver, or if one car enters the highway, and there are 900 other commuters on the highway, how does that one car affect those 900 commuters? Let's assume that it causes those 900 drivers to add another 2 seconds to their highway time. Now this doesn't seem like very much, 2 seconds added to highway time. But if we add that up across 900 cars, that's an additional 30 minutes that everybody on the highway has to add to their day. Not total 30 minutes to each driver, but adding 2 seconds to each driver adds 30 minutes of total travel time for the commuters on the highway. So if the value of time, suppose that the value of time is $16 per hour, then the appropriate congestion tax would be $8. And if I drive on the freeway, I slow down everybody else on the freeway by a total of 30 minutes, and if time is worth $16 per hour, I've cost the drivers on the freeway $8. So if the appropriate congestion tax is that tax which would get me to consider my effect on other drivers, that appropriate congestion tax would be $8. And then I would have the incentive to reduce the number of times that I was on the freeway and reduce it the appropriate amount based on how much. First, let's talk about macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the study of a nation's economy as a whole, the entire economy. It focuses on issues of inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. So macroeconomic questions are ones that look at what's the unemployment rate in the entire U.S. economy, or what's the inflation rate in the Japanese economy. The key is it's a nation's economy as a whole. Macroeconomics explains why economies grow over long periods of time and what leads to the business cycle over shorter periods of time. Right? We look at macroeconomics because we want to understand why economies grow. Over long periods of time, say 20 or 30 years, what makes standards of living rise in some countries and not in others? We also look at it to explain economic fluctuations. Why do we have recessions? Why do expansions last so long in some instances but not in others? And what different policies might we implement to try to lessen the effect of recessions? We also want to use macroeconomics to make informed business decisions. If you are a business manager and you're trying to look at what the interest rate is, or what's going to be the future of your labor costs, what's the future inflation rate, or what's going to be the impact of a given macroeconomic policy on interest rates or inflation, you're going to want to understand how macroeconomics works. The other subdiscipline of economics is called microeconomics. Well, microeconomics is the study of choices made by households, firms, and the government, and how these choices affect specific markets for goods and services. So where macroeconomics looks at the entire economy of a nation, microeconomics looks at one market, say the market for corn, or the market for gasoline, or the market for labor, and how the choices that households, firms, and governments make affect those markets for goods and services. We're going to try to understand microeconomics so that we can understand how markets work and how we can predict the changes in markets due to changes in the government or the firms or how households make choices. We also want to understand microeconomics because we want to help ourselves make personal and managerial decisions. On a personal level, we use economic analysis to decide how to spend our time, what career we want to work in, and how much to spend and how much to save when we earn money. Managers use it to try to figure out how to produce goods and services, how much to produce, and how much to charge for the goods and services that they produce. And finally, we look at microeconomics because we want to evaluate public policies. When we look at how the government interacts with the market economy, we want to be able to determine whether it was a good decision or a good policy that was implemented, and we need to understand microeconomics to be able. Graphs are pictures, right? And we all know that pictures are worth 1,000 words. It's much more efficient, much easier to understand how different variables interact with each other and how models work when we're comfortable with graphs. So we're going to look at a lot of graphs, and we're going to look at percentage changes of a lot of variables. So in this section, we're going to try to look at some tools and some graphs that you're going to want to be comfortable with. Now, there are lots of different types of graphs. Suppose we're trying to graph a single variable. Well, we could do that in many ways. One, we could look at a pie chart. Pie charts look at one variable and how it might be split up or distributed between different types of that variable. In this example, we're looking at the types of recorded music sold in the United States. This is from 2004. Right? So it could be rock and roll, rap or hip hop, and in this pie chart, we can see that rock and roll was 24% of recorded music sold in the United States in 2004. Country was 13%. And so one way of looking at a single variable and finding out information about it is from a pie chart. Another way is looking at a bar graph. A bar graph would compare a variable and different types of that variable by looking at the height of those bars. Here we're looking at U.S. export sales of copyrighted products. And so this bar over here is the amount of newspapers, books, and periodicals that were sold in 2002 as U.S. export sales. So if we want to compare this bar to this bar, which is computer software, we can see that there was far more computer software exported from the United States than there were newspaper, books, and periodicals. Another way of looking at a single variable is a time series graph. Here we're looking at total industry sales of some industry over time, and we can look at time on the horizontal axis, and we can see how that variable changed over time by looking at the time series graph. Now, it's important to understand how these graphs look. In fact, this graph is the same graph as this graph. The difference is the scale of the vertical axis. You can notice the one here on the left goes from 0 to $14 billion. In this one, there's a truncation in the axis. The vertical axis goes basically from 10 to 14. So it looks like this variable goes up and down more than this variable, but in fact they're the same variable, they just have a different scale. So when you're looking at a graph, and particularly a time series graph, you want to look at what the scale of the vertical axis is. Now, a lot of what we look at in economics are two variable graphs. Right? So there are several variables of the basic elements of a two variable graph. And any point on a two variable graph represents a combination of these two variables. We have the horizontal axis, also known as the x-axis, and we have the vertical axis, also known as the y-axis. The distance along the horizontal axis represents some amount of a variable, whichever variable is being plotted along the horizontal axis. The distance up along the vertical axis represents some amount of another variable, that variable which is on the vertical axis. So if we look at this point A, we can say at point A, this is a representation of 10 units of whatever's on the horizontal axis and 13 units of whatever's on the vertical axis. And one of the large or most prevalent graphs we're going to look in economics is supply and demand. In supply and demand, we generally have the quantity of a good or a service on the horizontal axis and the price of a good or service on the vertical axis. So in this graph, if those were the variables, then the point A would represent a quantity of 10 units and a price of 13 units. Now, any other point on this graph will represent some different combination. Suppose we looked at another point on the graph right here. Well, this would represent some amount of the variable on the horizontal axis, and here we're looking at quantity if this is a supply and demand graph, and some other amount of the variable on the vertical axis. And again, here we're looking at the price level. And what we would know about this point is there's a lower price and a lower quantity. So any point anywhere on this graph is going to represent some combination of quantity and price. So we're going to look at lots of what are called linear graphs. A linear graph is any line which has a constant slope or is a straight line. In this graph, we're looking at the relationship between the hours worked per week and the income earned per week. Now there's a number of things that you should notice about this type of a graph. Well, first of all, this is a positive relationship, meaning an increase in the hours worked increases your income. You know that because this graph points upward. And if we compared point B to point C, at point C there are more hours worked than at point B, and there's more income earned than there is at point B. Right? This is up and has an upward sloping curve. Now the slope of a curve is very important to understand. The slope of a curve tells you what the relationship between the variable on the horizontal axis and the variable on the vertical axis is. And one way to think about the slope of a curve is to look at the formula, which is the rise over the run when looking at two different points on that curve. Well, what's the rise? Suppose I'm going from point B to point C. The rise is how much you've gone up, or how much higher is point C. Well, we can look at that. It's 80 units of whatever's on the vertical axis. It's 200 minus 120. So the rise is going to be equal to 80. The run is the change of the horizontal axis, or how much you've moved horizontally. Right? So the rise is the vertical change. The run is the horizontal change. So when I move from point B to point C, I go from 10 to 20, so the run is the change, or 20 minus 10, or 10 units of what's on the horizontal axis. So when I calculate the slope, I can look at the rise divided by the run, and that gives me 80 over 10, or 8. So the slope is the change in the variable on the vertical axis divided by the change in the variable on the horizontal axis. And if we're graphing two variables, we can either have a positive relationship or a negative relationship. The positive relationship means that the two variables move in the same direction, like we saw in our last graph, and we would have an upward sloping curve. A negative relationship is one in which the two variables move in the opposite directions. And so we would have a downward sloping curve, because when one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. Another thing we want to know about curves and graphs is what makes the curves shift versus what means a movement along a curve. Now there's a pretty simple rule of thumb when looking at this, and it's going to be very important for you to understand it and remember it as we move through the course. There are two variables in this graph. Everything else is held constant. Right? The hours worked per week and income per week. Those are the two variables that we're looking at when we look at this curve. If either of those variables changes, we have a movement along the curve. So if we are at point B and we decide to work more hours, that would be represented by a movement along the curve to point C. And what we would see is income per week would rise. But it rose because we decided to work more hours. Now if something else changes, For example, suppose your allowance were to change, or the amount of money you get even if you don't work any hours, right? That's the vertical intercept. It's the value of income for 0 hours worked. That's what we call the vertical intercept. Now, if that changes, so suppose instead of getting $40 even if you don't work, it moves up to $90 even if you don't work. Well, that means your income rises even if hours worked per week doesn't change. Well, that can only happen if the curve shifts. So if a variable on one of the axes changes, you move along the curve. If another variable that impacts income changes, then you have to shift the curve. And if we wanted to graph a negative relationship as we saw, this would be the two variables moving in the opposite direction. Then we would have a downward sloping curve, and the result of that is a negative slope. We can also look at nonlinear relationships. Linear relationship was that straight line curve. Well, this is not a straight line, it's a curved curve. This is what's called a nonlinear relationship. This happens when, suppose we look at the amount of time you study for an exam and the points on exam that you earn on the exam. Well, the first couple hours that you spend studying for an exam have a significant impact on the number of points you earn. So if you decide to study a second hour instead of 1 hour, it's going to increase your production, or the points on your exam, by 4 points. Well, once you've already studied for 8 hours, you've already learned a good deal of the subject, and if you increase another hour, then the impact on your points might not be as large as it was for the first couple of hours. This would be a nonlinear curve, because the effect of study time on points is not constant as you increase your study time. And finally, we want to be very adept at computing percentage changes. Right? So when we look at two variables, or one variable and two values of that variable, if we want to calculate the percentage change, we need to look at the new value of a variable minus its initial value. An example we might look at is the price of a good or a service. So suppose we have the price in 2010 and the price in 2011. And we want to look at the percentage change of those prices. Well, the initial value of the price is 2010. So it's going to go into the formula here and here. And the new value of the variable is the price in 2011, and you plug that in here. So to compute the percentage change in the price of a good or a service from 2010 to 2011, you take the price from 2010 and put it in where the initial values go. And you take the price of 2011 and put it in where the new value goes. So you have the change in the price, or the change in the variable, divided by the initial value of that variable. You multiply it times 100 to get it to be a percentage change. You're also going to want to be very good at using equations to compute missing values. Remember, when we looked at the slope of the curve for hours worked in income, the slope was equal to the change in income divided by the change in work hours. Now, suppose you don't know the change in income, but you do know work hours and slope. Well, since we know this equation is correct, we can alter and solve for one of the other variables as long as we know two of them. So suppose we look at this first equation and we multiply both sides by the change in work hours. Well, if that's the case, then the change in work hours on the right-hand side will cancel each other out, and we'll have it left on the left-hand side, and we get an equation that looks like this. The change in work hours times the slope is equal to the change in income. So if you have an equation with three variables in it, and you know any two of them, you can solve for the third by looking at straightforward algebra to solve for the variable that you don't know.
Hello, class. So today we're going to start chapter 2 and we're going to look at the concept of thinking like an economist. So the things that we're going to cover in this chapter are, well, we're going to learn what are the two rules of economics and how different are they. We're going to learn what are models and how do economists use models to explain the world around us. We're going to see one model, an example of a model, which is called the production possibilities frontier, and we're going to see how it is related to the concept of opportunity cost that we learned in the first chapter. And then finally, we're going to see what is the difference between positive and normative economics, and also between micro and macroeconomics. These are the two big fields in economics, and so we're going to see what they are and how they